We are having for the 30th anniversary of the Northridge Earthquake, a webinar series from many organizations involved, as you see on the slide. My name is Mark Benthy, and I'm with the Statewide California Earthquake Center. I lead our public education and preparedness activities. One of those is the Earthquake Country Alliance, which created the Shakeout and other resources and activities, working along with Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, Southern California chapter, the Structural Engineers Association of Southern California, and both the ASCE, Association of Structural Engineers, Structural and Civil Engineers Los Angeles section, and the overall infrastructure resilience part of ASCE. So a lot of partners coming together for this series. We have had, and here we are again, we have had several webinars already, mostly kind of once a month or so. And you can watch the recordings of these also kind of through these addresses here, and also on the socal.eeri.org webpage too. And so here our most recent webinar was at the end of July, episode 4, and here we are at episode 5. And my co-moderator today from EERI SoCal is Farzin Zarayan, who will take over the introductions.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. I hope that my voice comes clear. Welcome, everyone. Today we have two great speakers, Lori Johnson and Rob Olshansky. The topic of the today episode is Legacies of Northridge Earthquake and Disaster Recovery, Planning and Policy, which our speakers are going to go through details how Northridge Earthquake become a milestone in U.S. disaster recovery management, and it pioneered new practices for disaster management, 9/11, the Katrina, Harvey, and other wildfires. A very brief introduction of our speakers. Rob Olshansky is a professor emeritus of urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His teaching and research have covered land use and environmental planning with an emphasis on planning for natural hazards. Lori Johnson is an urban planner at Lori Johnson Consulting, specializing in disaster recovery and catastrophe risk management. She helps communities and organizations address the complex challenges posed by natural hazards and disasters. Rob and Lori have studied the process of rebuilding cities following large disasters, starting with the 1994 Northridge earthquake. This was a very brief introduction of our two speakers. The list of their accomplishments goes through pages. I wouldn't waste much of your time and their time. I'll give the microphone to the speakers, so you have it. And again, welcome everyone to our seminar.
Thank you, Farzin. We'll pull up our slides and run those ourselves. But just want to, something I forgot to put on a slide that I want to say at the outset is that I'd like to dedicate this presentation to three people who were really influential in helping Rob and I get our careers started, especially funding our research. Bill Anderson, Ken Topping, who was our longtime colleague, and George Mader, who was at Spangle Associates, my first boss, but also a lot of the research that sort of the first generation that led to some of the work we did in Northridge and following that. So you can read actually the oral histories for both Bill Anderson, who was at the National Science Foundation and funded, as I said, our research, and George Mader at EERI's website in the oral history section. We talked about the title. Next slide, please. Just give you a quick rundown of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to take forward the first part and talk about a landmark study. I think Ron Aguchi mentioned this as well in the last seminar, called the Pepper Study, how that led to LA's recovery and reconstruction plan that was in place before the Northridge earthquake. And then talk about how pre-disaster recovery planning has taken hold since that time. And then talk a little bit about the study that as I mentioned, Bill Anderson funded, where Rob and I and Ken Topping Worked with Japanese colleagues over almost a decade, actually, of work looking at the rebuilding process in Los Angeles and Kobe after the 2 earthquakes there. And then we're going to talk about 2 of the 3 neighborhoods that we studied in depth in Kobe. So Hollywood and the influence of the Hollywood Redevelopment Plan, Sherman Oaks, and housing issues. So next slide. So the Pepper study. So this was also a National Science Foundation funded project that was started in the 80s. It really came out of, at the time, for many of you may know or have read, that there was some efforts to do earthquake prediction in the late 70s and the 80s. There'd been a claim by the Chinese that they had predicted the Tangshan earthquake. So LA was very interested, and Spengel Associates, Degenkolb, and I believe Earth Science Associates were the 3 organizations that worked on the Pepper study with the city of LA, where they did the very early landmark work on trying to estimate building losses for some scenario earthquakes. You can see down there the damage estimates at the time for a magnitude 6 scenario underneath LA being the largest estimate of 13 billion. I think we know now that number, I can't remember, Puente Hills, one of them actually has an estimate well over 100 billion for an event striking near downtown LA. But what was really important about this is just really think about, this was early days for GIS. ESRI helped, and Ken Topping, our colleague, was actually involved in this and then became the planning director for the city of LA and really shepherded the next steps. But they put together an inventory of structure types and then actually tried to estimate the severity of damages for the city's 35 planning areas. So really one of the landmark works of using GIS and applying that to land use and estimating losses for the purposes of planning for recovery. Next slide. And so what led from that was actually several workshops that the city had, and they said, you know what, we should go ahead and start to write a plan to be prepared for how we would rebuild, how we would deal with damage to land, ground failures in certain areas, and extensive building damage and infrastructure damage. And so out of that came a draft plan after many workshops and exercises as many departments were involved in this effort. Ken Topping became a consultant on the planning project. And then the plan was actually used after the 1992 riots, where there was actually, a lot of damage and physically across parts of LA. It was under review and about to be adopted by the city's Emergency Operations Board in late 1993, just months before the Northridge earthquake happened on January 17th, 1994. Based on the earthquake and the insights that staff got from using both the draft plan in the riots and the earthquake, they revised the plan, and it was formally adopted on the 1-year anniversary of the Northridge earthquake. Next slide, please. So just to give you a highlight of what it covered, because this really kind of gets to the point of the sort of early influence that this plan had on thinking about pre-disaster recovery planning. There were 8 topical areas: residential, commercial, industrial, rehabilitation, other things that were sort of in the sort of the realm of the physical space, the public sector, economic recovery, land use, and then 4 things that were much more organizational in nature. Setting up a recovery and reconstruction organization and laying out what authorities it would have, looking at the social services and human needs post-disaster. So I guess that one is actually more external to the city. But vital records, really looking at data and managing of data, and then also coordination and interjurisdictional relationships. There were pre- and post-event implementing actions. And each action had a lead department as well as an identification of other departments in the city that would be involved. So all over about 300 implementation actions. A large majority of those, next slide, please, Rob. A large majority of those were actually pre-event actions. And that's one thing about a lot of these plans, even now with the National Disaster Recovery Framework, It's really about the actions you need to take in being ready for recovery ahead of the event, as well as actions that you would take post-event. So following the 1994 earthquake, Spengel Associates and Bob Olson Associates received a small post-Northridge grant to actually evaluate the use of the plan. We conducted 20 interviews with 39 staff. Some insights for that were that in many cases, the big vision that had been laid out in this plan for this recovery and reconstruction organization really, in the city's view, wasn't necessary. It would have restructured governance altogether. Instead, leadership was really carried out through the city council, who set up an ad hoc committee for earthquake recovery, the mayor's office, and the chief administrative office. So they didn't, and the plan was substantially revised after that, just basically saying this was not that scale of event where we had such large scale damage that in this case, the planning department would have taken leadership of this recovery and reconstruction organization. But many cities and agencies carried out their major responsibilities assigned in the plan. Most said that even they may not have been on a day-to-day using this plan or on a day-to-day basis getting together through that recovery and reconstruction organization, most of them had accomplished their pre-event actions and felt that they were better prepared and knew exactly what they were supposed to do. So that the years of preparation and the actual exercises and use after the riots was really helpful for them to implement their work. And there are some really outstanding efforts that have been documented in our work and by others. The LA Building Department and its phenomenal management of building permits and other data using GIS and databases that were quite sophisticated at the time, as just one example. Next slide, please. So 2011, after Hurricane Katrina, FEMA and HUD were directed to develop a recovery, federal level recovery plan. And out of that came what is the National Disaster Recovery Framework. What I just want to highlight is sort of that emphasis again on looking at external factors in a community or in the built environment in our of things that need to be addressed. So very similar in a way to the operational structure of the LA plan: housing, infrastructure, the economy, social services, but then also some operational and internal things, such as how the coordination will happen across agencies, communication, and planning. Next slide, please. It also identifies coordinating agencies, the lead agency, and the supporting agencies. Similarly, now across the United States, we have states and local governments adopting that same structure. This is just a highlight of how California's recovery framework is set up, identifying in more detail how the state will organize, again, around some of those same functional area and operational areas, and then also encouraging local governments to do the same. There is no mandate right now for recovery framework development at the state or local level, but certainly you're seeing a movement to do so because organizations want to be aligned with the federal structure. It just makes coordination work so much better in the aftermath of disasters. What's interesting is to see in the early work of putting the framework together that the LA plan is referenced in those technical documents. Ken Topping was part of that process. And so while it's not explicitly a one-to-one match, it certainly is a very influential document. Next slide, please. And here are just a number of other documents from other countries that similarly are adopting the idea of doing pre-disaster recovery planning and having disaster recovery frameworks in place. And even, I will say the UN World Bank guide for doing a disaster recovery framework also references the LA Recovery and Reconstruction Plan. Next slide. So this is something I actually downloaded from Cal OES's website, where it really talks about what's the difference between a framework and a long-term recovery plan. And so just want to emphasize what you kind of saw as the contents, that this is really very organization focused in these pre-disaster plans, whereas the long-term recovery plan is really much more physically based and project based. Once you now know what the actual event impacts are, what the needs are, then you really can dig into more specifics about the kinds of projects you're going to undertake. Next slide, please. So now I want to switch and talk a little bit about our study and then hand it off to Rob. This study that we did in collaboration with our Japanese colleagues, and there you can see us a long time ago, was really comparing longitudinally how rebuilding occurred at a neighborhood level. So we tried to create some matches of conditions in the study of neighborhoods in Kobe and Los Angeles. And we had three, as I mentioned. One was the Hollywood district and a commercial district. Sherman Oaks, more of a residential, but also some commercial activity. Canoga Park being even more residential, with some very different demographics and economic conditions that also matched up with our other neighborhoods in Japan. We looked at what we felt were long-term factors facilitating or impeding reconstruction, complexity of property ownership patterns, financing, the existence of plans ahead of the event that could be used to inform recovery, institutional frameworks and designs and interactions, and the regulatory framework. We also, besides documenting the work on these specific neighborhoods, did some overviews of both jurisdictions and all of these issues, kind of the institutional setup, the regulatory setup that informed the recovery implementation in these two communities. Next slide, please. So just to talk a little bit about Hollywood and the sort of kind of setting up to what happened during the Northridge earthquake. Hollywood really took off in terms of its development. A lot of buildings that are on the National Historic Places list were built in the 30s and the 40s as the film industry really centered in that part of right below the Hollywood Hills in the central LA basin. In the 50s and the 60s, after the construction of the Hollywood Freeway, many of the studios moved north into the San Fernando Valley, into near Sherman Oaks and the Burbank area. And so did some of the commercial activities and residential activities as well. By the mid 70s, Hollywood was actually, by many accounts, on its decline. And many of the beautiful Art Deco structures built in the 30s and 40s were abandoned or really in much lower level uses and economic and residential occupancies. Next slide, please. So the city really began to put attention on Hollywood in the 70s. They were updating their citywide plan and adopted a new community plan for Hollywood that increased the heights and densities of residential and commercial zoning in the area, designating the area as a regional center for commercial development. The historic designations were made at a neighborhood scale in 1975. None of that was really working. And so in 1986, the city designated the area as a redevelopment district, which allowed it to actually begin to use a different kind of tool called tax increment financing that would actually allow them to, as the area accrued value, take the increase in that property value and the tax increment that came off of that and apply that back in the area for upgrades to other buildings. And that initial plan basically put the Los Angeles Community Redevelopment Agency as the city's lead planning agency for that particular area. All plans had to conform with the LA redevelopment, or the Hollywood Redevelopment Plan. They had an initial budget of about $1 billion to accomplish the vision of that plan. And as I mentioned, it gave them a lot of different authorities to acquire property, to demolish, to relocate occupants. So in the 1990 census, we had nearly 40,000 people living in the area as well. Next slide, please. So with the earthquake, it really was kind of the final blow to what the conditions in Hollywood. The economy, many have said, really was bottoming out. There was a recession going on in LA at the time, and Hollywood was really kind of at the bottom of its curve. You can see there almost 70 red tagged buildings, 130 yellow tagged buildings, a number of units. I think it was about 20% of the housing in the area was either yellow or red tagged. Many of these residential units were occupied by low income or immigrant populations, a huge diversity of language spoken in the area, which made a challenge for communicating with residents as well. Next slide, please. So really with the Hollywood Redevelopment Plan, and all the organizations were already used to working together there on the problems, they began to focus in and target on the things they could do. So the police and the city's attorney's office really focused on crime and abandoned buildings in the residential area called Yucca Street to the north of Hollywood Boulevard. A ghost town, and Rob's going to talk about this more, was designated in the area. The Community Redevelopment Agency created some additional redevelopment districts across the city after Northridge. This was a combination of redevelopment areas that they prioritized after the '92 riots, as well as some for the earthquake. And so there was a new redevelopment district added on the eastern end of the Hollywood area. And they, because of all of the programs they already had in place, as money became available, they just started pushing that money into existing programs. So they use community development block grant money. Rob's going to talk about that a little bit more, to fund commercial building rehabilitations. In some cases, some buildings, really historic, critical buildings like the El Capitan Theater, the Mayor building, buildings that you would recognize if you go down there, were actually funded at the scale of $1 or $2 million for rehabilitation. They did a facade rehabilitation program. They used their own insurance proceeds for buildings that they owned in the area and across the city, and pretty much targeted all of that for Hollywood. So they were all in on Hollywood. And then also the Metro Rail was coming in. So they targeted some money for the financial impacts of the disruption of that into the area as well. And that really opened up the contributions for matches from private entities, as well as other programs to be focused on this area. So the vision of the Hollywood Redevelopment Plan really became kind of empowered by the funding streams that were available after the Northridge earthquake. Next slide, please. So just some statistics of kind of what happened there. So 2 years on, over 40 buildings had been, 40 projects were underway, 27 more were in the works. So about 600 apartments had been refurbished at that point. The business owners got together with the Chamber of Commerce and actually formed one of the first business improvement districts in California. So this is where the business owners tax themselves to provide services like street cleaning, facade, maintaining, removing graffiti, things like that. This is something that was done across LA. And also, we won't talk about this much, but this was actually a practice adopted in Japan as a result of observing what was going on in LA with this recovery and the use of bringing business owners together in this way. And one big project that was instigated by all of this other activity in LA was the Hollywood and Vine project, Hollywood and Highland project, I'm sorry, which led to the creation of the Kodak Theater and now the permanent home of the Academy Awards. Prior to this, it had moved around from a few theaters in Hollywood, but was even being held out in Pasadena, I think, around the time of the Northridge earthquake. So it came back to Hollywood. And really, I think the whole, all of this wouldn't have happened. There wouldn't have been that leadership so quickly if the redevelopment agency wasn't there and the plan wasn't in place. Now I'll turn it over to Rob.
Great, thanks. And I just, I love the conclusion of this. Every year when we watch the Academy Awards on TV, that theater is a direct result of the Northridge earthquake. Okay. Oh, you had Well, I'll keep
I
going.
had one more. Yeah, I forgot about this one.
Okay.
So just want to say that redevelopment is a tool that's used yeah, after disasters, was used prior to the Northridge earthquakes. But it's been highly effective in New Orleans, in New York, and elsewhere. A great study by Spangle Associates, Redevelopment After Earthquakes, really talks about how effective it is, both for the planning processes, but also the financing that it can bring to bear post-event. What's important, I think, for us to think about, at least in California going forward, is that we abolished redevelopment in 2012. So our redevelopment agencies no longer exist. All that specialization that those agencies had in doing things like demolitions, property acquisitions, relocations are gone. We did create some new financing in California for what we call enhanced infrastructure financing districts. They can do a tax increment, but it's all very controlled and very much directed towards funding public infrastructure, which would be very important after a major earthquake in our urban areas. So we do have some aspects of that tool available, but it doesn't have the breadth that we had with redevelopment before its abolition. Thanks, Rob. Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to use the Sherman Oaks Study District as a way of talking about ghost towns and the subsequent use of U.S. housing and urban development block grants for disaster recovery. So the Sherman Oaks study area really exemplifies the value of using these block grants, which I'll talk about in a moment. That's money that's tailored to specific disaster circumstances. This changed the way we fund disaster recovery, which includes looking ahead to the next California earthquake. So Sherman Oaks, and I'm just trying to, how do I get there we go, get these pictures out of the way so I can see better. Okay, so the Sherman Oaks Study District, and so there it is. It had the highest concentration of damages anywhere in LA. Relatively high income area, so private resources were important, but still it was very, very heavily damaged. Red and yellow tag buildings contained over 3,000 housing units, which represented over a third of the housing in the study district was either red or yellow tag. And within it were two significant ghost towns, which we will define here. So these were areas of damaged multifamily housing. The city of Los Angeles, they became aware that there were these clusters of damages that were having, they were affecting communities and affecting adjacent communities. They eventually identified 17 of these, colloquially called ghost towns and then officially called ghost towns. So there were pockets of damage and abandoned apartments and condominiums, and they were identified as areas within high damage census tracts, and specifically areas with over 60% of the housing units heavily damaged or destroyed. And so that's pretty significant. So there were 17 of these places where they had these pockets of really where most of the housing was damaged, which meant there were vacancies, there were blighted conditions, they attracted gangs and crime. People were illegally living inside these buildings. Obviously, it deflated property values of adjacent areas. And with the declining rental income and high debts, all of this limited owners' abilities to get loans and make repairs. So these things, there were various metaphors. Some people talked about them like cancers. So there would be these 17 places. Each one of them was this festering sore in the urban landscape that was negatively affecting everything around it unless they could get a handle on them. So immediately, the city began their ghost town program, which really just sort of focused on stabilizing these neighborhoods. The housing department monitored the progress in them, and a combination of city departments prepared a security plan for the neighborhoods. They got some special FEMA funding that helped to support their efforts, and they also they were trying to study the conditions and possible solutions. And they found that most of the building owners lacked insurance. They didn't qualify for loans from the Small Business Administration, and they were unable to get private loans and financing. So fortunately, there was a a solution at hand, which was the multifamily rental property program, and it was funded by a HUD block grant, which I'll explain in the next slide. But the way this program worked is LA Housing Department got $320 million from HUD to assist in repairing these residential properties that were declined by the Small Business Administration. This block grant was enabled by supplemental congressional funding that was provided both in February and September of 1994. So Congress came in within, a month and then several months of the earthquake and designated this extra funding to the city of LA to be able to do this. And just simply the way that this worked is for existing property owners, they got maximum loan of $35,000 per unit, which again was determined at the time would enable them to be able to repair, rebuild, and 0% interest rate, and payments were deferred for 5 years. So this was really key. And then there were also for new property owners, so people who just bought these buildings. So some of the owners just wanted to get out. So there were some new property owners, and they also got very low interest rates and payments deferred for 4 years. And the results of this is by December 1995, the whole process had taken place. Most of the city funds had been loaned. The housing department expedited loan applications. It was a less than 30-day process. So it was really designed to get the money out quickly to the building owners so that they could get to work and repair these properties. And some developers, as people got experience with using this, some developers actually got the experience, and they figured out that actually they could even do this with private financing once they got all the methods down. And this was another key part that it catalyzed a lot of this private investment. And by January 1996, so that's just 2 years after the earthquake, approximately 2/3 of the ghost town units had their loans and the repairs were underway. And by January 1999, 5 years after the earthquake, nearly all of the units were repaired. So this was really a remarkable program and really helped to quickly turn things around and improve the perceptions of these neighborhoods and the city as a whole. It was really, again, if these things were cancers, I don't know what the metaphor would be, but this was the opposite of that in terms of really catalyzing the health of LA and turnaround from the effects of the economy and the Northridge earthquake. And the success was due to the block grant model. And so let's talk about block grants. So HUD's block grants, and so block grant it's what it sounds like. It's just one big grant, and it allows grantees to create their own programs to fit their own needs. And this is what enabled LA to be able to design the loan program for the specific conditions that it had in ghost towns. So let's go back a little bit and talk about block grants, where this program came from and what has happened to it since. So community development block grants, abbreviated CDBG, began 1974. I think it was the Housing Act of 1974. HUD has provided these annual block grants on a formula basis to states and what they call entitlement communities, which basically are metro areas and large and down to medium-sized cities. And they're for community development projects, which include housing, infrastructure, economic development, social services, and other related activities. So the first use of this for disasters was in 1992. Congress provided supplemental CDBG funding specifically for disaster recovery after Hurricane Andrew. They provided $90 million. And then again in the next year for the Midwest floods, $449 million, which was distributed to 9 states that were affected by that flooding. And so the idea here was to use an existing program as a vehicle for funding disaster recovery. And this was an innovative step that was just beginning in the early 90s. And so since they had just begun doing this, Congress came through again in providing this funding after the Northridge earthquake. Again, there were two different bills in February and September, and they provided a total of $399 million to Southern California, 308 million of which went to the city of Los Angeles for the rental housing loan program. And this was huge. This was much bigger than the ones that were given in the previous 2 years. And it was really the largest such a post-disaster grant to a municipality until the 9/11 block grant in New York City, which came 7 years later. So the success of this grant in efficiently catalyzing LA's recovery has really led to a rapid expansion of CDBG for disaster recovery. And this has become routine. And they now call it, they have the hyphen DR, disaster recovery, to distinguish it from the normal CDBG program, because it's actually now bigger than the normal CDBG program. Its annual budget now exceeds that. And as an example, last year, it was $5 billion for CDBG DR versus $3.3 billion for the normal annual CDBG program that goes to all cities. And so here you can see how it's just increased over time. I've labeled some of these large ones. The Northridge earthquake now looks small in the scheme of things. We had the World Trade Center. Hurricane Katrina and Rita was the most significant use of it. But then a couple of years later, there was Hurricane Ike, Hurricane Sandy, again, huge. Hurricanes Maria, Harvey, and Irma in 2018. There was a little bit of fire money mixed up in some of that as well. And I can't even label the rest of these because they're really given to multiple disasters. And that's really how it works now. It's now central to disaster recovery. The annual congressional allocations for multiple disasters are now routine. So they'll just routinely do, it's like in an omnibus bill, they'll just have one bill and they'll just list all the disasters for that year. They might even just say that any declared disasters that year are eligible. And since 2015, they've specifically been earmarking some of these funds for hazard mitigation. Even though, well, we know during recovery, it may seem backwards, but it's a time in which we can accomplish a lot of long-term mitigation goals. And so they call these CDBG-MIT, and these are increasing every year. The grants generally tend now to go directly to states, although sometimes they still go to municipalities such as Houston after Hurricane Harvey. Since 2016, California has received $1.6 billion in these funds that are distributed to grantees through the California Department of Housing and Community Development. The HCD has a full-time staff now that this is all they do is distribute CDBG DR money. So we now have the capability, permanent capability to do disaster recovery. And they routinely award these grants through its Recover California program. And here you can see just the list of some of the currently funded disasters that they're giving grants for. So the next large California earthquake will therefore will need CDBG funding for recovery. With the lack of widespread homeowner earthquake insurance coverage, there's going to be a high demand for housing repair programs, and so this is likely to be funded by CDBG. Although it depends on a willing Congress to do that, and it depends on a willing Congress to decide how much money they're going to provide. But presuming that happens, it'll then go to our experienced staff at the Department of Housing and Community Development. And given trends in the past, it's likely will include a large mitigation component, which should be of interest to those of us who work in the earthquake field. And so anyway, so that's that story. And I'm just going to tie a ribbon around this whole thing. It's just a little teaser of some of the planning lessons that we learned from Northridge and also from Kobe, from the joint study. And we've covered some of those things here. And you can read the full report to get more detail, and you can download it from the LFP website. So some of the conclusions we had was the previous plans and pre-existing institutional structures make the process much easier. And Lori certainly explained that in LA, and this was also certainly very true in Kobe. External funding, which can be both from insurance and from public funding, makes a huge difference for regional recovery. And so again, in the case of future earthquakes here, insurance is going to be important, but there won't be enough of it. So we're really going to need public funding, and CDBG will be important, as well as perhaps advanced infrastructure finance districts and other tools. Disasters have winners and losers. That goes without saying. And there were important lessons about both of those that we got from these studies. Disasters provide some opportunities for land use improvement. There were a lot of those in Kobe, not so many in Los Angeles, but Hollywood was a really good example of that. Community involvement is vital, especially if widespread reconstruction is needed. But reconstruction needs time to be accomplished thoughtfully. So don't be too hasty. And finally, land tenure issues complicate reconstruction. We had a lot of those in Kobe. The key one here in California is condominiums. They were a difficult challenge in 1994, and they will be at least as much of a difficult challenge in the next big earthquake in California. And if you want to read more lessons from more disasters, our book, After Great Disasters, we have a significant chapter on US where we talk about 9/11, Katrina and Sandy, and also chapters on recovery in Japan, New Zealand, Indonesia, China, and India. And this you can also download for free from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy website. And that's it. And I think we're even on time. So thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you both. And I just want to point to some already answered questions in the Q&A tool. You go there and click on the Answered tab, and you can read some questions that were posed that I've answered and that Lori has answered. Lori's were more specific to this webinar, but it is okay to really ask any question. We'll figure it out. But we do have time now. You can Charlie Scawthorne has asked you a question, Rob. Says it's great talk, but can you elaborate why condos are a problem?
Condos are a problem because of all the different owners in the building, and a condo might have structural damage, and all the different owners have to agree on how they want to deal with it. And it's what sometimes happens, and certainly happened after Northridge, is so you have a lot of different owners of different ages and different levels of investment in the building. And some of the people who moved in recently and just haven't paid off much of the principal on their loans, they just walked away. And we looked at some specific cases where a significant number of them walked away. So that makes it even more difficult. So the burden then for the entire building then lies on the folks who are still there. And anyway, and if they can, if they can get some financing, then maybe they can then sell those units afterwards. But it's an example of complicated tenure process. And we have a lot of condos here.
And I think the insurance issue also gets very complicated, right? You have some units who have insurance coverage for, everything inside the walls, essentially from the walls inward, and then the coverage of the building. And there will be multiple, now with the California Earthquake Authority, it's probably not as much a problem in California, but, you would have at least two different entities involved in handling all those claims. In the case of Northridge, there were many insurance companies, some of which had actually were in default or nearing default. So that also added to the complications. And, at that time, as Rob said, many people were upside down on their loans and they just walked away. There was not enough value for them in the building, considering the kinds of assessments they were likely to get as homeowners for the repair costs for the building. And we saw the same problem in Kobe. So yeah, I mean, that's when we talk about land tenure and the complexity of land tenure, condominiums, tenancies in common, which we have in San Francisco, probably more than we have down in LA. It's kind of an older practice of use, very common in New York as well. But those sorts of distributed ownership patterns are complicated because you need every owner to agree to the decisions that are made about the repair.
Yeah, and personally, if I were buying a condo, I would, at a minimum, I would make sure that the association had earthquake insurance on the building. But I think, as Lori's indicated, even so, things will still be complicated.
Having been a condo owner in the past, I know you can also have a loss assessment coverage as part of your policy, where if there is an assessment to rebuild, that might cover that. But you also need to make sure that everybody else has the ability to pay that loss assessment or have coverage. Because if only you, that building's not going to get repaired and rebuilt. So that adds to the complication of living with many other owners too. We had let's see, another question from Charlie. Following the Champlain Towers collapse in Florida, they've mandated structural condition assessment for residential high rises. Other East Coast states have followed. California doesn't have any of those requirements except special cases like unreinforced masonry buildings and soft story buildings. What are your thoughts on Florida type legislation in California?
Well, I'll jump in. I've been thinking about this a lot. I think, Florida in some cases, because of concrete and, the coastal location and exposure to salt, there's been a lot of concerns about the condition of concrete. But I think, we have this same issues in our coastal urban areas. And also we have a lot of, one of the things I know has been talked a lot in San Francisco is just, we really don't know what the damage was to buildings that weren't heavily damaged by the Loma Prieta earthquake. So we don't know what sort of internal conditions they have. And went through and potential vulnerabilities that might not be, visible at this point without some deeper investigation to know whether they have some added vulnerabilities that will make them more vulnerable even as collapse hazards in ground shaking in the next event. So I do think it's I think cities are trying to tackle that problem, even, sort of structure type by structure type. I know San Francisco is working on tilt-up and concrete building screening requirements as part of a potential retrofit ordinance. So, but I think having that statewide leadership is really helpful to deal with existing inventories of buildings.
There was an early question that I marked to answer live. I was meaning to write a text response from Dale, not related to this webinar, but that there was a minor earthquake in the Palm Springs area this morning or some morning. And I think it was today, that he reported it through the Did You Feel It tool on the ham radio wind link, which is great that you know about that, Dale, and that option that's available. I did put a link in the chat for everybody to know about Did You Feel It, which is a way that you can report your experience. The USGS does use that information to with all the reports for many people to kind of assess the shaking intensities of the earthquake and kind of validate the instrumental intensities that are recorded. So when you feel an earthquake, it is very helpful, even a smaller earthquake like that, to report and share that. So thank you for doing that, even through amateur radio. A couple of questions still in the chat that Rob and Lori, you can see from Terry Tran, CDBG, MIT. Do you know if they provide funding for exercise support and funding for labor hours on the federal level?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Funding for?
It says the statement is CDBG-MIT. Do you know if they provide funding for exercise support and funding for labor hours on the federal level? Do you understand what they're?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Terry, you could put, if you want to expand on your question, you could do that again in the Q&A or in the chat. We can come back to it. And same with Leah, your question, what are our next steps? What can we do now? Of course, there's lots of ways to answer that question. If you have any more specifics you'd like to put, we can then follow up.
Mark, I'll jump in on that one.
Okay,
which
sure.
is just my interpretation. What is and something I wanted to talk about is just we don't have a lot of jurisdictions in California or on the West Coast that have actually done pre-disaster recovery planning and begun to think about getting themselves organized for dealing with restoration of services at a holistic level, dealing with social services on a longer term basis than response, dealing with interim and long-term housing issues, economic recovery of business districts that are impacted, all these kinds of issues. Getting their head around it really is what a pre-disaster recovery planning exercise can. Or the Bay Area cities by the UASI, for those who are inside baseball, Urban Area Security Initiative, I think, and there are UASI areas across California. So we have a template for doing a local disaster recovery framework. I think Cal OES is in the process of developing some guidance on that as well. But right now, I think besides LA, I know San Francisco started working on a framework before the earthquake. Before the pandemic, sorry. And that project's been put on hold. Oakland similarly had started some work and I don't know that that's ever been published. If so, hopefully they have it, but it's not available on the website last time I looked. Seattle has developed a recovery framework that many people refer to who are looking for examples. It's a really good one. It talks about every recovery function actually has a non-governmental co-chair. So really looking at like economic recovery, okay, what's our key lead, private sector agency, NGO typically to work with on that, like the Chamber of Commerce in that example, or a nonprofit housing developer for the Partner for Housing Recovery. So that one is actually, a lot of people like that one as well. So I think that's something for all of us who work a bit more in the emergency management space, is really trying to get that organization leadership within our cities to develop these kinds of plans, and state plans too.
Yeah, planning ahead for recovery is what unlocks everything that we talked about here. So that's how you can cover organizational management, sources of financing, public sources of financing, private sources of financing, all the things that we talked about here. You should be planning ahead for, so that you can more adeptly apply them after the event.
There was a question that I answered in the chat that I just thought would be maybe tee up to Rob with a few minutes. It was about whether the CDBG DR is applied to U.S. territories like Puerto Rico and USVI, and the answer is yes. And I mentioned, Rob, that you're actively involved in researching the Puerto Rico applications. And I just think, if you have a few anecdotes you want to share there, it's been a very challenging process, as you've described to me.
Yeah, it has been. I'm trying to think of what I should cover here. But yeah, on my graph, that there was a very huge bar, Hurricane Maria, Harvey, et cetera. Really, most of that, Puerto Rico has gotten like $20 billion of CDBG funding. And you can get an idea of the challenges, and that event was in 2017, and most of that, by far, most of that $20 billion has still not been spent yet, due to a variety of reasons. And actually, I wanted to, there's strength in this presentation. Really, I sort of laid out all the positives of CDBG, and certainly the block grant aspect is a significant positive. It allows localities to be able to tailor the funds for their specific problem. LA was a really good example, and that's why it's so popular. But there's a downside to that, which again, we said, existing plans, existing programs are always are the easiest things to use after disaster. So it requires each locality has to invent their own set of programs. So Puerto Rico has had to invent a whole set of things, and it takes a long time to invent those, to send them up to HUD, to get comments, they come back, you fix them, and then you do some of these programs, and it's a learning process, and they don't work quite the way that you wanted them to do, and so you have to amend it, and so all of those things and more, which I don't have time to go into here, have been going on in Puerto Rico. In the end, I think it's going to be a very positive thing that Congress was very generous in providing that funding, and Puerto Rico is being very careful in how they spend it, and I think it's all going to work out well. But it really is time consuming, and it's one of the tensions of disaster recovery. You want to do it carefully, but you also you want to get things up and running as quickly as possible. And those tensions have been very much in play in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands as well.
That just reminded me of one short anecdote, which was LA Housing Department. As Rob said, the city got all those loans out before the second anniversary of the Northridge earthquake. So, in contrast to similarly to what Rob described, they had to invent this program. But one of the things I remember from our interviews with that staff was that they hired a number of people who had just finished up working on the housing or the savings and loan program, the failures of many savings and loans that had happened in the late 80s and early 90s. So you had these people who had worked in that savings and loan, I forget the name of what that was called, but that a resolution trust commission or resolution trust board or something like that. So they had S&L experience. They had been used to doing loans for homeowners at S&Ls, or in dealing with the defaults of those loans and the cleanup of the various S&L failures. And so they were very, very sophisticated and able to just walk in the door and start working. And I think that's really, when you think about what FEMA was envisioning when it created the community planning and capacity building recovery support function, that's exactly it. How do we create high capacity for local jurisdictions to do all the things they're going to have to do so we've tried to allude to today with a complex disaster recovery. And that's where, as I was talking about redevelopment agencies, they have that sophistication. They're doing it on a daily basis in dealing with the problems that you face after a disaster. And so the recovery planning becomes so much more important as we don't have those kinds of high capacity organizations or cities that just, when you really think about that patchwork of a big city like LA versus a really tiny little jurisdiction with a staff of less than 100, you'll have real disparities in their ability to lead their own recovery. It creates a lot of challenges.
And that's why we've developed the capacity here in California at the state level to manage the CDBG grants.
Barzine?
All right. Yes, I think that we are right at the mark. I have a few questions, which I hope that I can ask in a private session. I think we have hit the limit, but thank you very much, Lori, Rob, and all the attendees. Mark, it was a very fruitful seminar. I hope that folks attend other episodes of these series. A lot of good information is being exchanged. Good questions are asked. So with that, I give the baton to Mark to say farewell, and then from there we can go home.
Yes, thank you all for your presentations today, and Barzine for co-moderating, and for everybody who attended. Again, this recording of today's webinar will be on the website where you registered by early next week. So if you know others that weren't able to join, you can direct them and share that with them. And have a great rest of your day.